This is Dan Schneider, and on this edition of the Dan Schneider video interview, I will be talking with several experts about film noir, an American film form, its import, and its history, and we will start in just a moment. In this episode, we're going to talk about film noir, and I have two experts and possibly a third expert joining us shortly. Their names are William Luhr and Julie Grossman. And before we get started, I'd like each of them to just give a little bit of information about themselves and their interest in film noir. So, Julie, let's go with ladies first. If you want to talk about yourself for a little bit.
Hi, I am Julie Grossman, and I teach at Lemoyne College in Syracuse, New York. I teach in the English department and in the Communication and Film Studies department. And I have long been interested in film noir, wrote a book called Rethinking the Femme Fatale in Film Noir, Ready for Her Close-Up, in which I argued that the presence of the so-called femme fatale in film noir is exaggerated. I was interested in showing the stories that create the grounds for understanding the women in film noir more sympathetically than is generally seen. So that's my book. I teach film noir often, and yeah, I'm glad to be here.
William, a little bit of background about yourself.
Sure. I teach at St. Peter's University in Jersey City, and I'm the co-chair of the Columbia University faculty level Columbia University seminar on interdisciplinary interpretation, which brings in speakers throughout the academic year. I've written, well, my most recent book is called Film Noir, from John Wiley Blackwell. But it builds on, I've edited a book on Dashiell Hammett and written a book on Raymond Chandler. And my interest in Chandler 20-odd years ago was really what started my interest in film noir.
Well, let's take that as a segue. Hammett and Chandler seem to be seminal figures. Did film noir, was that more of a visual film movement, do you think? Or do you think that it evolved out of the detective fiction of the 20s and 30s? I'll start with William, if you want to just pick up where you're going.
I think it evolved from a number of intersecting movements or sensibilities. Certainly one of them was American hard-boiled detective fiction of the 20s and 30s. Another one was the new look of German expressionist film. Post-war, the look of Italian neorealism, and a change in narration in Hollywood during the war, so that nothing in film noir was new. But suddenly, after Citizen Kane, we have films that are obsessed with point of view. And during film noir, we have retrospective point of view and a focus on the individual. Another major influence was the popularization of Freudian discourse. So that where motivations in the 30s, let's say James Cagney in a number of gangster films, Public Enemy, Angels with Dirty Faces, the source of his, at times, hysterical sociopathology is largely poverty or bad times. 10 years or a dozen years later, you see him in White Heat, and he's a sociopathic killer that has nothing to do with hard times. It's because he's a Freudian disaster with an Oedipus. So that shift in motivation of where the dark side comes from also occurred at around the same time as film noir. So it's not one thing, it's a number of things.
Just so people know, we were joined by our third expert, Richard Edwards, and I'll introduce him in a moment. William, if could just have you finish your thought about the evolution of film noir from Hammett and Chandler novels and Italian neorealism and that stuff, if you could pick up the thread.
Sure. In sum, I was saying that film noir didn't come from one source, that it came from a coalescence of a number of sources, like American hard-boiled detective fiction, Italian neorealism after the war, German expressionism, the popularization of Freudian discourse, and related things. So it was a number of things coming together.
Yeah, it's interesting because I hadn't thought of neorealism's influence. But before we pick up on that, Richard Edwards, if you could just take a minute or two and just let the viewers know who you are and your interest in film noir, and then we'll continue the discussion.
Yeah, thank you. My background is I've been very interested in film noir for a lot of years. With my colleague Shannon Clute, I have a long-running podcast series called Out of the Past Investigating Film Noir that stretches back to 2005, where we pick one film every couple of weeks to talk about in depth, focusing on looking at these films with fresh eyes. I'm also the co-author of the book The Maltese Touch of Evil, Film Noir and Potential Criticism, that came out of University Press of New England back in 2011. And my interest has always been that this has been my favorite film style that came out of the Hollywood system. I just think these films are amazing and still hold up today.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Let's pick up the thread. Maybe Julie, since you had talked about the femme fatale and whatnot, let's talk about some of the elements that are considered film noir. As far as I know, just as a layman looking, it seems that around 1940-ish is generally when film noir is considered to have begun. And I know that the early Hollywood had a lot of sort of power brokers like Betty Davis and Joan Crawford and whatnot. Were any of these women influential in film noir in terms of starring in it? Did any women have any roles in producing film noir, or was it basically a male genre from the get-go?
Well, this is what we call in literary and film criticism a critical crux, right? Because depending on scholars' interests, you'll get different emphases in answering that question. It's a great question. Obviously, women were really prominent in film noir as they took on the role of the so-called femme fatale. You think about Barbara Stanwyck in Double Indemnity, Rita Hayworth and Gilda, Joan Crawford and Mildred Pierce, and other films. One thing that I guess I would add to Bill's really excellent introduction to film noir is, some people talk about the representation of women in post-war America as being tinged with this kind of anxiety about shifting gender roles, because the men came home from fighting in World War II, and the women had been working in factories, and there was a kind of moment when these these roles were called into question. So the sort of independence that women had gained during World War II was now possibly threatened or might change. And so some feminist scholars in particular argue that that has something to do with the fascination with the femme fatale role, a kind of combination of assertiveness, independence, and aggressiveness that can get transposed into the role of the femme fatale. And in a number of film noir movies, there is this kind of fascination with female agency. Even like Cora Smith in The Postman Always Rings Twice in 1946 keeps saying, she wants to be somebody, which sounds like a kind of, sounds like Edward G. Robinson in Little Caesar saying, I want to be somebody. So there are interesting echoes of, calls for agency and independence by women that I think add a lot of the sort of vitality and fascination to film noir movies. One
of the things that I've noticed, and in recent months, there was a couple of movie channels that came on. I live in the Texas area, one called Movies Network and another one called Get TV, and they run a lot of like the old Columbia Films backstock, I guess you would call it, and they have a lot of film noir. And one of the things that I noticed that in the sort of 20-year period from the 1940 to 1960, when film noir is considered the golden age or the main era, is it seems that it went more from early star vehicles with a Humphrey Bogart or an Edward G. Robinson in it, to being more low budget, more almost like William had said, neo-realistic. There was one film, there was one film about a prison takeover from like 1951. I forget the name of it, but it was actually quite good. Was there an internal evolution within film noir itself? In that it did become less star-driven, it did become more socially conscious, and if so, was that something that was good for it, or did that, engender its demise by, say, 1960-ish generally? Richard, maybe if you want to, do you have any?
Well, I think it's an interesting point. What I wouldn't necessarily see it the way you kind of set up the question, because based on the way that we wanted. Let me restart that point. Sorry. What's interesting when you start to say that you start to see all these films from, say, Columbia on a local cable channel, that's to be expected because film noir was a very popular vehicle for storytelling for the B film industry. So in the era in which film noir starts to begin, you have really 5 major studios that have to produce product every single week. These are your MGMs, your Warner Brothers, your Paramounts, and so forth. And during the time that film noir is being started, all of the professional talent will be under long-term contracts. And so these studios will start to typecast certain characters, that Humphrey Bogart will appear in a certain type of film, that Alana Turner will be in a certain type of film. In the parallel to the major Hollywood industries, you also had all these Poverty Row studios. And while Columbia wasn't quite Poverty Row, it was really just a few notches above it in this time frame. And this filmmaking style, film noir, was such a great boon to creativity because if you didn't have a major star like a John Garfield or a Humphrey Bogart, the amazing worldview of noir made up for cheap sets and less well-known actors. And so a lot of studios really gravitated towards film noir. And what's interesting nowadays is that these are really the ones that have fallen into the public domain and tend to be seen, actually, ironically, more sometimes than the better cast, better funded films. So a lot of people know these works because they show up on DVD, anthologies, and so forth. But so I wouldn't see the evolution necessarily between these types of films and the Hollywood A films. I would instead start to say that as this style started to get popularized in the post-war period, the part that's always interested me as a film noir scholar is that there clearly was an audience for this type of filmmaking. And part of what happens with Hollywood, and it was true in 1946 as it is in 2015, filmmakers go to where the audiences will buy tickets. And by the late 40s, noir was something that could sell tickets. And so all up and down the chain, from MGM all the way to a small studio like Producers Releasing Corp., which employed the brilliant Edgar Ulmer, who did quickie masterpieces like Detour, everyone wanted to get in on the game because there was money to be made by doing these stylistic, hard-boiled thrillers.
Yeah, William, let me just return to you, and you bring up Italian neorealism, because I would never have really thought of that being a connection, because I had interviewed a fellow about a month or so ago about the career of Humphrey Bogart, and he had mentioned High Sierra and it's the first famous gangster flick with Petrified Forest, and those as being sort of proto-noir. Would you consider some of the gangster films from the 30s sort of proto-noir? And was there some kind of element that took those gangster films of the Cagney 1930 kind of era, Cagney Bogey, and sort of catalyzed them to become something more that we consider film noir?
Well, sure. To the extent that the gangster film in the 30s had largely burned itself out by about 1935, 1936. They were a comet at the beginning of the 30s. And then they became hit by two. They became unfashionable, and they became, at times, troublesome because of censorship. So that you had Howard Hawks being forced to put in the opening prologue to Scarface. where you have newspaper editors talking about how horrible these things are and directly addressing the camera. You know, we must stop this kind of look.
That was the Hays Code, was it not?
It was influenced certainly by the Hays Code, which then became the Breen Office, the Breen Code. So that by the mid-30s, most people, whether it was James Cagney, A.W.G. Robinson, or Paul Muni, were shielding themselves from gangster films. And then when they reemerged in the 40s, they emerged in a different modality, because much of film noir is not about rising gangsters or rising violent sociopaths, but about the guy down the block, about middle-class people who appear to be utterly normative. And then suddenly you find out that they're sleeping with their boss's wife, that they're robbing the company, that there's a level of pathology in them that's shocking. So that part of what film noir is about is the normal that's suddenly not normal. It's horrific.
Yeah.
If
Can I add something?
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Sorry. I think Bill's point about neorealism and the average person as the subject of film noir is really important and interesting. And you asked before about women involved in film noir, and I'm now working on a book on Ida Lupino, who's best known as an actress who figured in film noir movies like High Sierra, which we mentioned, and also On Dangerous Ground and others. But she was also a director of a very good film noir movie called The Hitchhiker in the early 1950s. And she was profoundly influenced by neorealism and was really interested in that very point, that films should be about about real people in a kind of in a kind of pedestrian context, people who have problems that viewers can identify with. And when Bill was speaking, I was thinking about this sort of world weariness and of a character like Walter Neff in Double Indemnity. You have those great shots in that film of the office space and the sense of sameness of every day that makes these characters want to kind of walk over that line and indulge in the dark side. And I think that's, a large part of the fascination of film noir is that, the sort of transgressiveness that, that viewers were attracted to, and that, film noir represented a kind of underbelly of American experience that, was kind of opposed to the, what some call the flag-waving, piety of, standard Hollywood films, certainly of the period. So,
Right. Pardon me. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to jump in because I think that the point on Italian neorealism, I love the way Julie took it towards, other factors in the post-war period. But the one that I still think is something that was picked on very much from Hollywood was Italian neorealism also really moved away from the set-driven dramas into going out into the streets with lightweight, flexible cameras and realistic lighting. And you really see this profound shift if you watch a lot of films noir. One of the tendencies that I think is very visible to a viewer is if you watch films like Laura or The Maltese Falcon or The Postman Always Rings Twice, these films made between 1945, they really could have been shot on the exact same set as The Thin Man, a film from the 1930s. But by the time you get to a film like Jules Dassin's Naked City, you're really starting to see a profound shift. They're moving from, the Hollywood studio sets into on-location shooting. And I think that's where they get a lot of the impact of neorealism. And again, part of what fascinates me is how that then creates an appetite in the viewer for this, that how all of a sudden, one of my favorite examples is rear screen projection. Rear screen projection looks really valid to my eyes because I buy into the artifice of what the filmmakers want me to believe. But once you start seeing cameras mounted on actual cars, you start to be able to see a contrast between one style of filmmaking and another, kind of a clash between formalism and realism. And I think film noir was one of those great movie-making phenomenon that starts to really teach us different ways of making and receiving these films.
Yeah,
I'd like to add to what both Julie and Richard have said, and because I realized that I never really answered your question, Dan, about neorealism. And it's simply that throughout its history, which is current, film noir has always been an octopus. In other words, it's basically seized and devoured what's around.
Yeah.
So that if one thinks of early film noir, people tend to think of studio-bound films like Scarlet Street that tend to be about adultery, tend to be about inner psychic turmoil. If you look at films of the late 40s, suddenly you're getting films that have, in many cases, very little to do with sexuality, very little to do with a studio-bound environment, where you have films that are shot on the streets with, with location lighting, and that's because Hollywood suddenly, after the war, became influenced by neorealism in a way that where previously it had had little interest. And also, it wasn't only neorealism, but it was documentary filmmaking in the States, done by people like Louis de Rochemont, and the influence of technologies developed during the war, which were faster film stocks, the ability to shoot more in a more mobile fashion.
Let me end this segment with a final question, and then we'll talk about sort of the heyday and the big names, the directors, the actors, the big films that exemplify it in our next segment. But always associated with film noir is the concept of the anti-hero. Do you think that the anti-hero, well, first, what is the anti-hero, and did that predate film noir, or is it really something that was popularized by film noir and came out of it and is something that was unique to that form that has since been absorbed in other art forms? Anyone?
Well, I mean, the anti-hero is a highly elastic term.
Yeah.
It can go back to Oedipus or to Hamlet. The term generally applies to someone who goes against the dominant codes considered good of the time. And I don't think there's anything new in film noir in terms of an anti-hero. But what part of what is new is a different way of looking at why somebody who's wrong became wrong.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
No, and I think it goes back to, the way William set it up at the very beginning. I mean, I still see so much of the film noir phenomenon coming out of the pulp fiction writing of the 1920s and 30s. And you really start, I mean, it's hard to give like a brief summary answer here, but clearly within popular entertainment, things start to shift in the 19th century. And in my standard film noir lecture, I almost always start with Edgar Allan Poe as one of the godfathers of noir, because I think you start to see a particular strain in the way that Americans handle detective fiction that is very different from its European counterparts. What, of course, becomes ironic is that what makes film noir such a heady brew is it is endlessly hopping over the Atlantic in this wonderful transactional way where then European artists start to steal from the Americans, and we then keep constantly, like a tennis ball being batted across the Atlantic, finally emerged somewhere in the 1920s, coalescing around publications such as Black Mask magazine or any type of, pulp fiction magazine that costs 5 cents or less, and, start to tell a certain type of story that is more reflective of a modern view of crime and human connections. And, we have the two great craftsmen right at the dawn of that style of writing. You have Dashiell Hammett, who really, I think, sets up a template that is powerful for Hollywood in one particular way. He understands how to tell a great story that is really within the poetic style of Hollywood. I mean, when you start looking at adaptations like The Maltese Falcon, part of the genius of what John Huston did in 1941 was to literally change nothing in what Dashiell Hammett had done in 1929, because the template was there. And then you get the great craftsman Raymond Chandler to fill in parts that are slightly different from the Hammett touch. And so they really did want to focus on, I wouldn't say the word anti-hero. I've never really been a huge fan of that, because I still think one of the great points brought up in our conversation already is that noir is not like Oedipus, in that we're not really talking about kings driven by the vanities of God. We are talking about normal people, frequently just normal Joes trying to get through an average day when they make one fatal mistake. And we watch for 90 minutes the playing out of that, awful, course of action.
Julie, final comment?
And I just add, yeah, sure. Yeah, that's all great. And I think that, the idea of the anti-hero, may be helpful in the sense that it suggests that sort of combination of idealism and cynicism that for me really characterizes a lot of these films. You have the famous line, I think this is from The Art of Murder, is it, Bill, from Chandler's
Sorry.
That's the line.
Yeah, right, that's the line. Chandler says, "Down these mean streets a man must go who's not himself mean." And this idea of, the noir hero / anti-hero as being just a little bit more virtuous than everybody else. But also, a cynic who has flaws, as Richard was suggesting, that combined with the sort of failure of institutions like the law, marriage, other social institutions creates this sort of, fascinating pot.
Okay. We'll take a break here, and when we get back on the next segment, we'll talk about the vintage golden age of film noir and the key players and films in that era. And we'll do that in a moment. In this segment, I want to talk about, as I had mentioned, the key films, people, directors, actors involved within film noir. And I just want to make a point. Someone had mentioned the public domain earlier. Originally, I was going to, in between each segment, have some public domain film clips from online that I had gotten, but when I downloaded and then uploaded it to get some of them, one of them was from Sam Fuller's The Naked Kiss, which is a famously public domain film, and YouTube, some German company claimed a copyright to it, and so that's why anyone watching this in the next few months is actually seeing it on my second educational Cosmoetica channel, because YouTube doesn't seem to respect the public domain. But that's a topic for another show. So unfortunately, I won't have some clips that I had wanted to just talk about. But let us talk about what would be. Do each of you have an agreement, say, on what was the seminal or first film noir, or the first seminal film noir director? I mean, or is it, again, just sort of a pick and choose?
Well, don't most people mark film noir, classic film noir, as beginning with The Maltese Falcon in '41 and perhaps ending with that very self-conscious film noir 1958, Touch of Evil by Orson Welles? But, it's a kind of arbitrary setting of borders, as we've already suggested.
Yeah.
I mean, I go a different way. Instead of thinking about what's the first film noir, I try to identify which films noir were the ones that, seem to most embody, what we would come to call film noir. And for me, it's always Out of the Past that I think is the film that comes out in '46 that really clarifies the noir style. So it's hardly the first film noir, but it possibly is the best.
Yeah.
My sense of first is After the Last.
Interview,
meaning that film noir is a retrospective.
It's okay, it's Sunday.
In that a cliche among people who were involved, like Robert Mitchum or Edward Dmytryk, or it's endless, is that I never knew I was making film noir when I was making film noir.
Yeah.
The term had no currency in the United States, in Hollywood. The term didn't get currency at least in the United States until the 1960s, until film studies started to become part of the academic world, and it was the term was largely coined in France in 46. And it was a term that was retrospectively looking back over the product of Hollywood's in the previous few years. And so what we consider film noir is something that was defined in many cases, at least until 1950, after the fact. And I suspect I would agree with both of your choices. Certainly, perhaps for me, the pinnacle of film noir is Out of the Past. My sense is the first big splash was probably Double Indemnity. But clearly, I mean, people have argued that Maltese Falcon doesn't, it has the thematics of film noir, but doesn't look like a film noir. It's not a drenched, shadowy kind of look. It's a very traditional studio look. But is film noir a visual style? Is film noir a thematic bundle of, well, a bundle of themes, or a cluster of other things? And lately, people have started to talk about the visuals, the thematics, and other things as part of the same barely containable package.
Yeah.
Right, and when and sorry.
Go ahead, Julie.
I was just going to say, when you talk about the visuals and the themes, it becomes a genre as opposed to a series, as I think Paul Schrader argued most famously, that it becomes a genre that's transhistorical, which is where you can get film noir sort of absorbing the concerns of any socio-historical moment and thriving. So.
Can I just add one final coda to those points? I think the other element is that it's always, for me, a question, because I agree with Bill that there's a lot of backwards mapping of film noir. A lot of these filmmakers didn't know they were making these films, and they're labels we attach after the fact. But when I'm watching a film noir, like if you set me down to watch 100 films in the 1940s, I would probably take a subset of those 100 films and place them off to the side, saying these films seem to be doing something different. And for me, it's this idea of the kind of the other side of the American dream. I mean, Hollywood films always had the Hollywood ending, and films noir started with the idea that living in the 1940s was now a kind of nightmare. And those films that really embrace that sense of what I would call, dread and nausea, then I kind of know I'm in the right place. And as Eddie Moeller, who does the Great Noir City Festival, always likes to quote, you also get the famous line, it's a bitter little world. And what's funny is, as opposed to like big proclamation of what film noir is, that to me sometimes is the best way to encapsulate it. You're watching a film noir if after about 20 minutes in you feel you're watching a tale about a bitter little world. Then you're probably knowing you're watching a noir.
One of the things that I had mentioned earlier was that there seemed to be a shift away from earlier films considered film noir being star-driven vehicles towards more of a lower budget. But I think also there was, it seemed to me, just as an outsider, that there was also more cast-driven, because I'm thinking of one of the films that I was going to show a clip of was Kansas City Confidential, which I think was a terrific little low-budget film, and it didn't really have any big stars. It had a really tight little script. It was really well filmed. There were lots of little memorable, quotable lines in it, and it was really about the people and them revolving around this thing. And you knew in a certain sense who the bad guy was, but in a sense you almost rooted for him. And I think that's one of the things that with film noir is that you get to sort of step outside of yourself and root for the bad guy, because in most films before that and after that, we know the bad guy is going to lose. In these stupid superhero films now, that Iron Man or Superman or Batman or whatever man is going to beat the Joker or whoever. But in the film noir, you were never sure. And sometimes the bad guys did, if not win, they were stalemating. And so, what did anyone? Julie, do you want to pick up on that?
Well, I think that's great and important in a number of ways. I mean, one of the most famous scenes in a film noir movie from the classic period is what's the character's name? Udo. Richard Widmark throwing his, an old woman down the stairwell in a wheelchair, and I mean, it's gleefully evil, and I think that there's a kind of release in seeing these characters who with whom we identify, who are doing these terrible things. Not that we identify with the truly evil characters, but this idea of snapping or being caught in a trap. I mean, there's a line in Out of the Past where, Robert Mitchum says, I'm caught in a frame and all I can see is the frame, which for me is such a great, noir line about the sense of entrapment and the sort of the fatalism and the desperation, but the humanity of that kind of that experience that is multi-layered. I mean, it's about human flaws, but it's also about social institutions that are failing, and all different kinds of sources of that bitterness that Richard was referring to before.
William,
there's also an aspect of it where it plays almost sadistically with our heads, using point of view. And I want to cite two scenes, one in Double Indemnity, where Walter Neff and Phyllis have just murdered her husband. And they get into the car to leave. And she tries to turn the ignition on, and it doesn't turn on. And they both say, uh-oh, because if they're caught there, they're caught near the murder scene. And she tries again, and what's going on there is and ultimately it starts, but it's a fascinatingly perverse moment, because you've just seen them commit murder. And now, as an audience, we're rooting for them to get away. And that, almost instantaneous flip around of audience point of view to, oh my God, they're killing this guy. And then, God, I hope they can get away. I mean, and if we look almost 20 years later at Hitchcock's Psycho, right after Norman Bates has killed Janet Leigh, he packs her into a car and drives it into the swamp. And we see him watch as the car sinks, and then the car goes bloop, bloop, and then stops, and it looks like it's not going to sink. And we get a back and forth watching the car, and Hitchcock has manipulated our point of view to getting us to hope that the car sinks, to hope that the guy who we've just seen slaughter Janet Leigh in the shower get away with it. And that very perverse playing with our heads is also part of it.
Yeah, and I think that goes all the way through the actual structure of telling these stories. I think that's one of the reasons why there's a predominance of flashbacks in film noir, that we're never getting the story straight. We never quite know who's telling the tale on the up and up. We never quite know all of the factors, because so many of my favorite films noir, whether they're films like The Killers or Crisscross, are as much character studies of men under incredible duress as they are any sort of genre crime plot. Additionally, the other part that's great, to continue riffing on this idea, is as you watch these noirs more closely, I think it is in these little story touches. I think that, one of the parts that I, again, know that I'm watching a film noir is when I start to just, in the back of my head, something steps up that this is just not how you would tell a straightforward, classic good guys versus bad guys crime thriller. And it is these little moments that I think bring in these little story touches that, frequently, to me, noir is a story of fate and about faithful consequences. And, the great film, The Killer, where you have Burt Lancaster as the Swede, starts the movie out by saying, I made a mistake once. But that's all it takes in the noir universe.
Yeah. You mentioned Richard Widmark, and I wanted to talk about some seminal or important people in there. And actually, one of the films that I was also had a clip was actually was considered, from what I've read, a noir western that I had seen years ago but hadn't seen for probably 35, 40 years, called The Yellow Sky in 1948, and it had Gregory Peck. And Widmark is just terrific in it, and it made me think. My dad, when I was a kid, I used to watch Abbott and Costello movies and film noirs with him, and you know, he loved Jimmy Cagney, he loved John Garfield, and Richard Widmark was his favorite bad guy. Do you think that Richard Widmark was probably the prototypical villain in a film noir, because he had good looks? He was usually portrayed as this blonde or almost all American, and yet there's this aversion that he's almost always the bad guy, and he's the smart bad guy in most of the films.
That's really interesting. Yeah, that Yellow Sky is a really strange movie. I mean, that's a really interesting movie. I mean, there were other hybrid Western noir films. I think of Johnny Guitar, with Joan Crawford. But you know, Yellow Sky is fascinating, and I agree. Richard Widmark has a lot of charisma as a bad guy, and you know, that's an interesting point. That, you know, he seems like he could be playing, you know, a Hollywood lead. You know, handsome male protagonist, and so nicely represents that idea of the sort of dark underbelly of, you know, the Hollywood hero. And so that we get back to that idea of perversity, you know, that Richard was talking about. You know, you I think we're planning to show a clip from The Naked Kiss, which you mentioned before, and for me, that film is just I mean, I'm off the main question that you asked, but this idea of the town hero being a pederast, you know, is just, you know, a kind of is utterly noir. But yeah, Richard Widmark was a very you know, I use the phrase, you know, gleefully evil. You know, that laugh, you know, the cackle of Richard Widmark is quite stunning.
William, do you want to pick up on anything? Yeah.
Well, I mean, in the clip from Yellow Sky, what for me it has in common with the other clips that you had is a central aspect of film noir, in that much about film noir is that it's post-mortem, that these characters in many ways are already dead, or perceive themselves as a line that's recycled endlessly. My future's all behind me. And that in the very physical look in Yellow Sky, the guys are staggering along. When they arrive to the town, it looks they're all dropping dead. And in film after film, we get, sometimes they are dead. In other words, Sunset Boulevard literally starts off with a shot of William Holden dead in a swimming pool. In Double Indemnity, we have Fred McMurray walking down the street saying, I heard my footsteps. It sounded like the footsteps of a dead man. And in the clip you had from DOA, where he walks into the homicide division, Edmund O'Brien as Frank Bigelow, and says, I want to report a murder. Who was murdered? I was. And the perspective in film after film is from somebody who has nothing in his or her future, mostly his, and whose life and life equals doom is all behind him. And what we see is simply the playing out of what has already happened. And that's part of the way that the retrospective narration fits into it. It's not like it can be changed. It's already happened, and it's already leading to this dark doom space.
Yeah, let me just you know,
Can I just jump in to finish and put one other point to define, because you're also asking just about, you know, the noir actors and, you know, who was popular, and you know, we can, you know, most people have their own list, but you know, clearly for me this was a style made for faces that were owned by people like Humphrey Bogart and Robert Mitchum and even Richard Widmark. Like, they're not the classical beauties. These are not the Clark Gable types. These are not your classical leading men. And yet, in these types of stories, my God, I mean, I start to think about, you know, my favorite films in film noir, and let's just do alternative casting. Let's put Gregory Peck in The Killers, or let's switch out, Burt Lancaster with, Clark Gable in certain roles, and it just wouldn't work. Like, part of what is amazing is that at the same time that Hollywood starts to embrace this style of filmmaking, they also start to find a role for a certain type of leading man that really would have just been a bit player 10 years earlier. And they become the lead. Then on the female side, with the femme fatale, to go back to a point we made at the very beginning of this discussion, this is also a style that was really tailor-made for a certain type of beauty. And I start thinking about an actress like Jane Greer, who I don't think would have been a star in as quite the same way if she had to be in musicals. I mean, it's just like, this was the type of film that brought out the best of her acting persona. And, so you really could be an A-list star in this era and be highly associated with this type of dark crime thriller we subsequently came to call film noir. But boy, did some of our greatest actors in retrospect have their best films acting out these bitter little stories.
Yeah,
If I could, one addition to that, another thing that intrigues me about these stars is that many of the young up-and-coming stars of the 40s, whether it's Burt Lancaster in The Killers or the number of noirs that he did, or Mitchum, are absolutely defeated, doomed people. Whether we see Mitchum, whether we see Lancaster and others, but then what happens to them in the 50s? In film after film, Lancaster is playing a pirate. These guys are suddenly in the 50s action adventure stars. And so the sort of semi-doomed, dead, limpid looks that we get of Burt Lancaster waiting to be killed at the beginning of Killers is suddenly transformed into these rugged action stars who tended to dominate the 50s. But I'm sorry, Julie, if I cut you.
No, not at all.
I just wanted to make a point. I hadn't thought about the yellow sky and the horror stuff, but it just dawned to me that in things like Yellow Sky, and I can't remember the name, but there was a prison riot film that I had seen a couple of months ago that was really well done. It might have been, but I think of some of the Italian horror films by Mario Bava. I don't know if you are familiar with that, but also Carnival of Souls and Night of the Living Dead, and the very high contrast black and white from those films had to have been influenced by film noir. And it's just interesting. You get these sort of metaphorical dead people that in the 1960s in Italian horror and in a low-budget American horror become, literal ghouls, vampires, zombies, and whatnot. And speaking of influences, it's just an odd thing. I mean, do you see any connections there? In the influences of film noir outside of film noir, in that sense?
Everywhere.
Yeah.
Well, I'm talking too much, but I just, one thing that happened after '60 is that by the early '80s, film noir not only gobbled up other genres, but also became a strong presence from Blade Runner on in science fiction. And it continues today. But the science fiction films from the early '80s are quite commonly about a doomed future. In other words, a future that, even though it hasn't happened, is already doomed and is very much like the noirscape of the past.
Let me just ask. I was another series of films that I was watching on one of these movie channels was the Western cycle, the renowned cycle of Randolph Scott and Bud Baedeker. And I was just wondering, is there, when you talk about John Huston, these bigger name directors, would Jules Dassin be considered maybe the I don't know if I'd call him a B director, but is there someone like a Bud Baedeker in westerns? Is there an equivalent in film noir that's the director, that's sort of the gold stamp, but isn't a big a Hollywood film director?
Well, I mean, for me, it's always Edgar Ulmer. I mean, Edgar Ulmer made several iconic films noir. Well, working at Eagle Line and Producers Releasing Corp., which were Poverty Row Studios. And most critics now agree that Detour, his 1945 film, is one of the most essential films in film noir that was shot on a budget that would be the equivalent of a person doing a student film today. So, I mean, you know, we have people like that. Someone like Jules Dassin's a more complicated and interesting example because he really was on the way to being a major A-list director, and his contributions to film noir cannot be understated because his 4-film run in the late 40s is about as good a 4-film run as I think a storyteller is humanly capable of. And he failed to reach the heights in Hollywood that he would have reached because he got blacklisted. I mean, he was a victim of HUAC. You got to always remember that history is really wrapped up in all of this discussion, and part of what's so hard to kind of summarize all of the marvelous observations we're making is every point can spin out into a million other subpoints, but especially around someone like Jules Dassin, we really have a 6-year interruption in his filmmaking until we see another film noir, the great 1955 film Rififi, simply because he was active in the Communist Party in the 1930s and subsequently had to flee the United States to move to France because he was being brought up, you know, on charges of being a communist. So, you know, but to also go to your point about, you know, do we have a Bud Bideker type? Yeah, I think there are several lesser known to the general public filmmakers who did their best work in film noir. A person like that all three of us have cited numerous times here, Jacques Tourneur, is not really a classic A-lister like Hitchcock, but when he was given the reins to film noir, he made amazing contributions, but again, in ways that you want to see the past always being the future. You know, you're like starting to mention some of these great Italian horror films. You know, Jacques Tourneur started in Val Lewton's shop doing stuff like Cat People, so he always had the horror influence on noir, but then of course noir then begins to do influence with other types of horror, especially European cinematic horror. It's always fascinating. I mean, to me, it's always this ping pong ball, and just to watch the way that smart, collaborative, brilliant storytellers are just riffing off each other.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We had mentioned Richard Widmark, and another underrated actor that I think did a lot of great roles within film noir as well as outside. You'd mentioned Gilda. Glenn Ford seems to me to be sort of the prototypical film noir hero. If Widmark is sort of the prototypical bad guy, you know, arguably, what do you think of Ford's work within the genre, specifically of film noir? Any of you? Go ahead. Anyone?
Well, I mean, you know, Ford was, you know, did great work with Fritz Lang in The Big Heat, of course, which is one of my favorite film noir movies. And then Human Desire, was that also Fritz Lang, I think? Yeah.
Yeah.
And was in Gilda, and also, you know, just became a sort of, you know, an iconic male presence in film noir. So, you know, another actor I was thinking of, and, you know, maybe it's the resemblance to Richard Widmark, but Dan Duryea. I mean, he's an example of someone the general public doesn't know, but, you know, his nasty presence in Scarlet Street, I mean, he was a very magnetic bad guy. So he's one I would mention.
He was deliriously sleazy.
He was. He was.
You know that he's gonna
so good. It's a snake. And visually allied with the snake figure in that film too.
Well, let's end this segment and go out before we hit our next segment. Let's just talk about what Julie had mentioned, the femme fatale. Who would be, or what would be maybe the definitive role, do you think, or roles 2 or 3, if there is? Certainly, I think Rita Hayworth in Gilda gives, I think, probably the best performance that I can say. I haven't seen all of her films, but of the 8 or 10 films of hers that stick out in my mind, I think that's by far her best film performance. So would you agree there? And do you think that Hayworth is a good, and she was also in The Lady from Shanghai too?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are lots of different ways to answer that question. Certainly, you know, the most canonic we've mentioned, Phyllis Dietrichson in Double Indemnity, Cora Smith in Postman Always Rings Twice. Jane Greer is so fabulous, as Richard mentioned, in Out of the Past. I love Rita Hayworth, and I think Gilda's a really interesting movie, but it has, you know, two protagonists. I mean, she's a classic film noir. But she also is, you know, wickedly smart. She has some of the best lines in the film, you know, and so, she's not this kind of opaque figure. You know, I think of Jane Greer and Phyllis Dietrich. Sorry, I think of Kathy Moffat in Out of the Past and Phyllis Dietrichson as similar in the sense that they're opaque. Like we have no idea what their motives are. They're just kind of bad.
But and if I could just jump in, I mean, I think the other flavor here that opens up because of World War II is more portrayals of the working woman, which really, there were very limited roles for females in the 1930s. You really were, you know, the mother figure or, the love interest. World War II, for me, you just start to see an eruption of an expansion of roles for women. And for me, the face of that is Joan Crawford. Like yes, Joan Crawford,
yeah,
in Mildred Pierce and Possessed and things like this, she's the one who can play the working woman and also the femme fatale at the same time.
Yeah, I agree, and that's the fascination. Those are the most interesting roles for women, I think, of the period. I love Elizabeth Scott too, even though she's got a sort of sadness in her visage. But in a movie like Andre de Toth's Pitfall, she's a working woman also, and sympathetic, but also driven to badness, at the same time. And it's that complexity that I think is really, really compelling.
William, any final comment from you?
Well, there's a very bright woman at Stony Brook who's retiring now, but she a few years ago she did a wonderful book called Women in Film Noir, and one of her main theses is that many of the women we remember are women who were evil and who get punished at the end of the film, who get shot, whatever. But that opened up a back door for an advanced roles for women. That Phyllis Dietrichson's evil, she's got to get shot dead. But what was perhaps semi-conscious on the part of the filmmakers is that she's as smart, if not smarter, than any man in film. And in film after film, these femmes fatales are, your gauge as an audience to hate them because they're so evil. But if you step back, you realize this is one smart person, and it's a woman who doesn't need a man. It's a woman who, in many ways, wants what the best of the men or the worst of the men want: money, power, independence. And so what Anne argues is that basically film noir, for the first time in American film history, opened up a back door for a new and greater and more respectful roles for women. Yeah, they were bad, but for the first time, they were real smart and savvy.
And that woman, what was her name, the author?
E. Ann Kaplan, Kaplan.
Okay, go ahead, Julie.
I was just going to say, and I think what Bill is suggesting. Sorry?
Why?
I was just going to say, what Bill is suggesting is so important that what we call badness in the representation is symbolic of power, of strength, power, and a kind of independence that was, I think, thrilling for female viewers as well as male viewers, maybe in some similar and some different ways.
Okay, well, let's end this segment, and in our next segment, let's talk about sort of the decline or the end of film noir and why it might have come to an end, and influences that barrel through now into the 21st century, and we'll do that in a moment. All right, well, in this next to last segment, let us talk about the decline, if we will, of classic film noir and what might have precipitated it. In the break, I just mentioned that possibly television and might have played a role. Does that ring true, do you think, or was it something, a larger social circumstance?
Can I just say something, just maybe to start the conversation here? I mean, if film noir was at least in part trying to represent the underbelly of an American experience as a kind of, as a response to the American dream, then in the 1960s, when we had a spate of, we had the civil rights movement, we had the feminist movement, maybe, or at least some people have argued, there was less need for this kind of, for a genre or a series that was exposing that underbelly because it was happening in a more mainstream way. So that's one way to answer it, but I'm not sure that I would agree that, film noir had its demise, because I think, as we've all been suggesting, a film noir sort of grafts onto whatever's going on in a particular socio-historical moment. And some of the most incredible film noir movies came in, the 1970s with Chinatown and Taxi Driver, and then I think Bill mentioned Blade Runner in the early 80s. So maybe that's just a start.
Richard, how about you?
Yeah, I think, clearly there was an outpouring, a flowering of noir filmmaking in the late 40s to mid 50s. It became a dominant style that many, many filmmakers, yeah, one second, sorry. Okay, thank you. I had to get checked it out. It was, so people always, when there's an aesthetic movement that has such an amazing outpouring, people want to have a sense of, why did it end? When did it end? Now, part of this is a very complex answer that gets into the economic system of Hollywood, that the actual ways and terms under which the first films were made shifts in the Hollywood cycle. And, I don't want to get into too much minutia, but you really see the downfall of actually the studio system itself in the late 1950s, moving much more towards the model we know today, which are independent producers packaging stars and directors and screenwriters to make films. At the same point, I also want to say that what's so fascinating to me is, again, how, even if we want to say that there's a decline in noir filmmaking in the late 1950s, probably for a variety of reasons, that Hollywood starts to go more towards investing in big budget spectacles. This is the birth of CinemaScope. This is the birth of color filmmaking. And we know that, if you want to start to talk about the demise of film noir, you don't have to look as far as television. You can look at filmmakers themselves preferring color film stock over black and white film stock, and audiences no longer paying to go see black and white films, thinking they're missing something because a color film, Technicolor, has more life to it. But even if we want to say that there was then a great decline in the number of films that are made in this period, this is exactly the point at which the French New Wave takes off. And you can't tell me that literally they pick up the baton with films like Breathless and Band of Outsiders and Melville's Bob the Gambler, Bob Le Flambeur. So you get this moment that every time someone wants to say noir is dying, all I ever see as a cinephile is how many ways it wants to live.
Yeah.
William?
Yeah, as there were numerous antecedents and causes for film noir, it strikes me that there are also many reasons why it appeared to die out at the end of the 50s, beginning of the 60s. But then it came back with a vengeance with neo-noir in the 70s. Of the reasons are the black and white filmmaking, which was the norm until around 1960, suddenly became utterly unfashionable, and people didn't want to see it. And that was associated with film noir. Television, certainly. In other words, where the B-film largely disappeared because it became absorbed by television. And part of film noir's métier were detective stories and crime stories. Suddenly there were 7 or 8 crime stories on television at night. And a question was, well, why do we go to the movies to see a detective chasing a criminal when we can see it tonight, on the Perry Mason show or whatever? there was a sea change in Hollywood in terms of what became able to be monetized, that what people wanted to invest money in. And the film noir became seen very quickly as old-fashioned, as part of the past. And then it came back. And one of the intriguing aspects about neo-noir is that where nobody or most people during the canonical era really knew that they were making film noir, it's impossible to argue in neo-noir that everybody knew that they were making it. In other words, that Chinatown, Long Goodbye, there are highly self-conscious films that have on their chest, this is building on film noir. Right. So that the revival was highly referential and self-conscious. And also much about, there was a sort of eroticization of the past. The people who watched film noir during the canonical period looked at people who were like themselves. They looked at men who were dressed in suits and fedoras, and they could walk out of the theater, and that's what the people would look like. That's what the automobiles would look like on the street, the hairstyles. If the people who saw Chinatown in in the early 70s would walk out of the theater, nobody looked like Jack Nicholson. Yeah. Nobody had that kind of haircut. Nobody had the pinstripe suit. That you were aware, even if the neo-noir was set today in the present, whenever the film was made, it had, as in Body Heat, there was a strong generic vibe that this is a genre echoing a past genre.
Let me end with a final question to all three of you, and then we'll give you each a closing remark. In the 21st century here, do you think that there's any film genre that serves the social purpose, if you will, that film noir did? And I think most Hollywood blockbusters today are horrible, but I think for me, the genre or form that is at its peak right now is documentary film, in terms of how it's, tackling social issues within the country. And it seems to me that film noir arrived at a time before documentary films really took off. I mean, you have people like Errol Morris now making films. You have blatant propagandists like Michael Moore. You have a lot of smaller little people now, because of the technology's advance, being able to make really quality films about social issues. So my question, I guess, is, do you think that documentary filmmaking serves the kind of social purpose perhaps that film noir did? Or if not, do you think that another format might? Anyone?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I'm always struck by, I think it was Paul Schrader made the point that film noir provides aesthetic solutions to sociological problems. And, that's always, kind of resonated for me, that part of what's even, moving about film noir movies is the way they, they're so stylized, but they're deeply engaged in the social and kind of standing up for the little guy or for the oppressed woman or, for people who don't have resources. I mean, think about, the character in modern film who has the least resources of just about anybody is Travis Bickle. And the fact that, Scorsese and Schrader are able to, make this beautiful film that sort of astounds viewers with, the kind of the aesthetic beauty of the filmmaking, while what we're watching is, a character who's, utterly marginalized and has no resources and is kind of is incoherent psychologically. I just want to add one other thing that I think we haven't talked about, and that is the setting of the city, which I think, became really pronounced, obviously was important in classic noir, but became really pronounced in neo-noir, where Chinatown is really talking in a sort of noir epic way about the birth of the modern city in Los Angeles. You have The Last Seduction, a more recent film, which is very much about New York, and this sort of dynamism, but also the themes we've been talking about, the sense of anonymity associated with the city, and the city becoming a kind of character in and of itself, as a sort of critique of the modern, and its draw, but also its sadness in some ways, in terms of such anonymity.
Richard, would you want to pick up on my point about, do you think that there's any kind of genre that serves the social purpose of film noir? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very interesting question. Where my brain would go to start to try to craft an answer is, what are our parallels between, say, the 21st century and 50 years ago? And for me, it would be the defining events around 9/11 and the War on Terror. And so you start to ask yourself that just like we were in a post-war period from 1946 to 1959, since 2001 through 2014, a relatively same span of time, we have been dealing with issues of national trauma, of terrorism, of unstable individuals. And then you look at what films Hollywood is releasing. And one of the big changes, of course, is that we now invest so much into every single film. The $100 million, but even now they're now saying $300 million is going to probably be a new basis for filmmaking. You're not going to be getting the same type of smaller stories that focus on individuals. And yet, I would argue that there are filmmakers, I might be a minority opinion, but filmmakers like Christopher Nolan in the Dark Knight trilogy that actually returned back to film noir to try to mediate some of our issues around terrorism and fear and national trauma by, again, he couldn't do it straight up. He had to embrace the comic book noir character, Batman. But I think that we are trying to see some filmmakers. Then I would also argue that around 9/11, we have had a cycle of films around the War on Terror, films like The Hurt Locker, American Sniper, and so forth. And I think these films try to function as more ambiguous tales, but I don't think we really do have our style that is as nuanced and as unbalanced in its approach as film noir was in the post-war period. Even when we try to get into complications of dread and different types of characters, these $100 million epics just can't take the final risks that a smaller budget film could.
And aren't they more triumphalist in just their very nature?
No, they are, and they have to be, because they got to bring the seats in. I mean, I think, to go back to William's great point, I mean, one of the things around television and the B films is that B films didn't have to be successful. They were actually sold to theaters on a fixed rate contract, which is important because A films were tied to ticket sales, but B films weren't. And so they never really had an incentive to have to make a certain type of story to fill the seats, because they had pre-sold the film. That was all the money they were ever going to make on the film. And it allowed B films to explore more ambiguous, more blank, less satisfying endings. But yeah, if you invest $100 million in your film, you want your money back. And sadly, mass audiences want a triumphalist ending. I mean, that becomes audience dynamic.
That's an interesting point. William, do you have a comment?
Well, I mean, documentaries is very much a rising form. There's major work being done in it. My sense is that, at least with canonical film noir, much of it was a disreputable form. In other words, that people didn't talk about these films as they would have talked about many A pictures. And some films noir had an overt ideological agenda, like Crossfire. I mean, something like Detour, as far as I know, has no overt agenda in terms of convincing the audience of the evils of anti-Semitism or etc. That it's a sleazy story about doomed people. And part of the appeal of it is that it's sleazy, is that you can see losers lose as the film progresses. I guess if we're going to talk about something contemporaneous where we see a lot of what was in noir, I'd agree with Richard in that the science fiction film today, even though they cost hundreds of millions of dollars, we get endless tropes like the what is it, the Edge of Tomorrow, the Tom Cruise thing about my life is recycling. It recycles every day, so that the sense of time is kicked out of shape, and the disorientation that I find in so many films noir um, comes again and again and again. The what X-Men Days of Future Past. It's that we can't even rely on the present and the past and the future, because now we can go back to the past and change the future, and so that traditional certainties, the rug's been pulled out.
Well, let me give you.
Sorry, can I just add one more thing? One of the places where you see noir now is on television. You know, in a show like True Detective, or you know, some of these cable series that are, you know, have that kind of attention to script, you know, and you know, small stories that I think, you know, it's interesting. You were asking about the demise of film noir, and you know, Norma Desmond's line, it's the pictures that got small. But I think now you are seeing this kind of flowering of, you know, of the genre on television.
Yeah, and I just would have to always give a shout out to what I do think is the most noir television show of the last 50 years, Breaking Bad. Breaking Bad would have been done as a B film in the 1950s. It became a 4-year series under Vince Gilligan, but it's noir in its heart. You look at the heart of that show, it'll poison you.
I agree.
As well as transgressive stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, unthinkable even 20 years ago. Now television is flooded with autopsy shows, whether it's CSI or that kind of, and again, it's looking at the insides of dead bodies. The story's already over, and yet now we want to figure out why it came over. But we see them bringing up the viscera of the person who's dead.
Well, let me give you each a closing remark then about a film noir, whatever you want to say. So, Julie, maybe if you want to go first.
Just I agree with you know, a lot of the comments that speak to, for me, the richness of the genre, the series, whatever you want to call it. For me, you know, it's an abiding theme and style that I think continues to fascinate viewers because of its willingness to sort of tell stories and show sides of characters that, you know, are not ameliorative. That don't, you know, have us leaving the movie, you know, feeling good about ourselves and feeling good about the world. And for me, that's, you know, that's a kind of that's art, you know, making us think and feel, and not just reproducing a formula.
Richard, if you want to have a final say.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks for, you know, hosting this discussion today. I've really enjoyed it. My comment is always the same one when I'm talking about film noir. I just hope people go back and watch these films. Part of what is so thrilling about living in 2015 is the availability of these films. When I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, it was not easy to get my hands on the mother lode of the great films of films noir. But with on-demand, Blu-ray, even the internet, you can find these films. So if someone's been turned on by what we've talked about for film noir today, it's not what we're talking about. Go see these films. That's what it's about. And these films are just some of my favorites. I dedicate my life to watching the moving image. And you know, these are going to be great viewing companions for you. Just go out and just see as many as you want.
William, final comment?
Sure. I mean, I very much agree with both Julie and Richard on their perspectives, and I suspect I piggyback on part of what Julie was saying, in that for me, a lot of the appeal of these films, whether it's neo-noir or whether it's the canonical noir, is they're pushing the edge of the envelope. They're reveling in the transgressive. And while I'm watching it and putting myself in the time period in which the film was made, I'm saying, what, you can't do that. Damn, you're doing that. Wow. You know, so it's moving into areas that just a minute ago you thought, well, no, they really couldn't jump that fence. And now suddenly they have.
Well, thank you, all three of you, for your comments. I just want to, what Richard had said, Project Gutenberg, the Internet Archive, they both have films. There's also a website, I believe it's called Open Source, that has something like 120 or 150 films noir, as well as other films. And if you just Google, you can find a lot of these films. And I know kids today, anything written before 1922, you can basically find online as well. So I would encourage people to do that. Next week, my next show will actually be on essay writing. So if you enjoyed this discussion, join me in another week. And again, thank you to Julie, Richard, and William.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Dan.
Okay.
Thank you, Dan.
It's been a
All right.
pleasure.